32. The Charlatan. This close, Charlie could smell the sour sweat of the Hierophant's body. She held tight to the book and turned her gaze to Salt. "Shall I give it to him?" "No!" Salt barked, then saw the warning in the Hierophant's face and modulated his tone. "Bring it to me, so I can verify this is the authentic volume." Charlie frowned. "So you don't want me to give it to him?" "Do not make me repeat myself," Salt said. "Bring the book to me." Her heart pounded. There were so many chances to get things wrong here and only one chance to get them right. People were watching. Vicereine was close by, but so far with no reason to be anything but amused. "I can promise you this copy of the Liber Noctum is authentic," Charlie said, "since I got it from your safe, along with a certificate from Sotheby's and a receipt from the auction. The book never left the house. You just let everyone believe that it was stolen." "Is that true?" the Hierophant croaked out. Salt began walking toward Charlie, allowing him to lower his voice, making it harder for the rest of the crowd to listen in. "Let's discuss this further in private." Charlie had puzzled over why Salt had set her an impossible task with an even more impossible deadline, unless he wanted her to fail. It was thinking about that which made her remember Knight Singh's opinion on the Liber Noctum. If there had been a ritual in the book to let a blight take human form, then nothing made much sense. But if there was no ritual, if the book was as useless as Knight had claimed, then Salt was free to employ the rumor to convince a blight to help him. But that depended on keeping the book forever out of the blight's hands, and yet seemingly obtainable enough to stay hooked. Hence the need for a thief of the original volume, Edmund Carver. A new possible lead, Paul Echo. And the most recent red herring, Charlie Hall. If she hadn't shown up, Salt could have convinced the Hierophant she had the book and was hiding it from him. And Charlie would wind up with her guts smeared on the ceiling, just like the others. Or she could have shown up to the party to say she hadn't found the Liber Noctum. That might help some, but Salt would accuse her of holding out, and her guts would still wind up on the ceiling. What Salt needed was someone for the Hierophant to blame, anyone other than him. Which meant he knew where the book was, and the simplest answer for how he knew was that he still had it. She'd had a bad moment when she saw Red in the cell, not just astonished by him, but abruptly sure she'd been wrong about everything. But then she realized he must have been the convincer, the reason the Hierophant believed Salt in the first place. If there wasn't a ritual, then how could he exist? "Private? I don't think so," said Charlie, shaking her head. "You're responsible for a lot of murders. Knight Singh, for one. I'd rather not be next." A wave of murmuring moved through the crowd. It was one thing to chuckle at a party's host bickering with a guest. An accusation like the one Charlie was making required a more serious response from the cabal. "Come along." Salt grabbed for her arm. "What did that young woman say?" asked Malik. He stepped forward, several others with him. Charlie didn't think surrounding Salt was intentional, but it spoke to how the mood of the room had shifted. Two things she'd known from the time Salt forced her into his car at gunpoint were that he wanted control more than anything, maybe even more than power, and that he expected absolute obedience from those he considered beneath him. He sent his shadow toward her. They were close enough that it might not have been immediately noticeable to the crowd, but she felt it brushing against her shoulder and cheek, as though she'd been touched by a piece of muslin whipped by a breeze. She only had time to gasp once before it flooded into her skin. She could feel it worming inside of her, trying to force her to speak, trying to make her tongue form the words that would cause her to deny everything. Long ago, when Charlie had come to Salt's house with Rand, she had practiced rolling up her eyes into her head to indicate that she was possessed, had been ready to speak with another voice. Ever since Alonzo, she found it disturbingly easy to be someone other than Charlie Hall. A relief to give in to such an old urge. "I'm drunk!" she shouted in a deeper voice than her natural one. "And a liar! A drunk liar! Also, I have a secret resentment toward the fantastic, handsome, totally not a killer Lionel Salt, who is most certainly not trying to puppet me." He stared at her, mouth agape. Everyone was looking at his shadow now, the way it had bent against the light to get to her. "Get out of my head, Mr. Salt," she said in her normal voice. Laughter bubbled up around them. Charlie allowed herself to step away from the door to the garden, the one whose proximity to the darkness had hidden what was changed in her, what she was lacking. The shadowless can't be controlled. There's a door shut inside of them. There would have been no way for Charlie to come here and confront Salt if it was possible for him to puppet her. It had been surprisingly hard to give up her shadow, but she'd sewn it to Posey's feet and trusted her sister to care for it. Charlie wasn't destined to be a glomist. She was destined for this. "Lionel," said Vicereine, "that was naughty of you." "I wanted to force her to confess the truth," Salt said, a hectic flush on his cheeks. He managed to sound calm, however, as though this was all just a small and embarrassing disagreement. "I shouldn't have done that, but she has herself been deceived." "Do you know something about the death of a Cabal member?" Malik asked Lionel. "Because that would have been a hell of a thing to keep to yourself, no matter what the truth is about your involvement." "I did not think I would have to reveal this. Certainly not here," Salt said, looking around, annoyed. "But you see, I have been working with the Hierophant to catch the murderer of Knight Singh. And we have succeeded." "Oh. Did he catch himself, then?" Charlie asked. "Because he's the one who killed Knight, on your orders." "Be quiet!" the Hierophant ground out. Salt turned toward Charlie with a sneer. "The Hierophant has served the Cabal faithfully," Salt said. "Who are you to question his loyalty, thief?" "Stephen, what's this about?" Bellamy asked, peering at the Hierophant. The name of the human, the one who Charlie was almost sure wasn't in control of the body anymore. It wasn't just the way he spoke, but that he had the wan, sickly appearance of someone whose energy was being consumed. "She's a liar," said the Hierophant. Salt looked at Charlie and shook his head sadly. "Oh dear, yes. Our boy tricked you, didn't he? The deceiver deceived. You're not the first." He turned back to the others, his confidence that he could get away with this growing. "Now, perhaps we can do this part in private. I have something to show you. Something I would prefer we kept between the four of us." Viceroy and Malik shared a glance. Malik nodded to Bellamy. Yes, I think so, Viceroy said, with a look at Charlie. I believe you said your name was... Charlie, she said. Charlie Hall. Miss Hall, I promise you that we'll hear your accusations and pass judgment. Malik nodded. Bellamy regarded her with interest. We can be fair. Charlie was certain they could, but less certain they would. Let us adjourn to the library, Salt said, and I will tell you everything. He signaled to a young man in a suit and tie. Get him for me. Bring him in the cuffs. The other gloamists watched them leave, a few of them stopping one or the other Cabal members to ask them a question or make some comment. A few laughed. The Hierophant walked behind them, his gaze returning over and over to the book in Charlie's hands. You, Salt said to her under his breath, are nothing more than a piece of gristle between my teeth. She tried to ignore him, tried to ignore the shudder that went through her. He was just picking at stitches, hoping she'd unravel. It was uncomfortable to be back in the library, her gaze going automatically to the small stain on the rug. But only for a moment, because Vince was already there, standing against a shelf, his arms bound in the same onyx restraints that had been hanging on the wall in the hidden hallway. She took in the despair in his gray eyes, his broad shoulders and the muscles beneath them, took in the dark gold of his hair and the angry line of his mouth. Looking at him made her stomach hurt. Shar, he said, you should have gone when you had a chance. She turned her face away, not sure if she was capable of doing what was necessary with him watching. And who is this? Malik asked. That's Edmund, his grandson, Bellamy said, peering at Vince as though trying to convince himself of something. I thought he was dead. Oh, we'll get to that, Salt said. Adeline entered the room in her long black gown and perched on the arm of a chair. Can I get any of you a drink? Charlie, having been drugged once in this room already, shook her head. Viceroy settled herself into a chair opposite Adeline. All right, Lionel. Now, explain yourself. He looked relaxed, pleased. Charlie thought he might even be enjoying himself. I became involved with the Hierophant because we had a common interest. The murderer of Night Singh was also the murderer of my grandson. It stands before you, in his guise. But it isn't him. You're looking at his shadow. That is impossible, said Malik. Are you saying this man is a blight? Asked Bellamy, walking up to Vince. Vince glowered, but made no move to step away. Bellamy reached out a hand. Almost immediately upon touching Vince's upper arm, he pulled back in surprise. He turned toward Viceroy, who said nothing. My grandson had always taken a somewhat unorthodox approach to shadow magic. He treated his shadow like an entirely separate being, one he let make decisions for them both. Eventually, it became independent enough to trick him. Trick him? Bellamy echoed, more intrigued than astonished. Masks were almost exclusively interested in mysteries, which led to lots of academics and even more mad scientists. Charlie had always figured they were a bit of a hodgepodge of the other specialties, and she could see why someone like Vince would be especially intriguing to them. He was deceived, into conducting a ritual from the book, one that proved fatal. Charlie interrupted him. That's not true. You're the one that killed Remy. Did it tell you that? Salt asked, making his voice gentle. It used Remy's life and created this shell in which it's hiding. It then absconded with the book and began murdering anyone who knew about it. A rare book dealer, Knight, who'd had access to the Liber Noctum while it was at Sotheby's. And finally, a thief who'd I'd contracted to steal it back. It all sounded reasonable when he said it, and Vince stood there, denying nothing. Charlie could feel her control of the situation slip away. Shadows lie, my dear, Salt went on. If you have a blight stitched to you, it will whisper in your ear, and every glow-mist knows not to believe everything it says. That is why it is a heavy burden to drape yourself in another's shadow. Charlie glanced at the Hierophant. As much as Salt might be enjoying this, the Hierophant was not. Both of you are claiming to have solved the murder. You're saying that's a blight, and it's responsible for all those murders, Malik said to Salt, then turned to Charlie. While you, for some reason, believe it was Lionel and Stephen. She nodded, glancing at Vince, who still didn't speak. Knight's not the first Glomus Lionel Salt killed, either. Salt smiled and stood, pacing the room, clearly believing he'd already won. Allow me to order proof of my version of events. Adeline, my dear, what did Edmund call his shadow? Charlie was dressed in the color. Red, the scarlet of poppies and cutthroats. Adeline smiled at her. Red. And what was on the walls where Adam Lockin, that thief I hired, was killed? He asked Charlie. The word red, she told them reluctantly. Painted in blood. But it was meant to threaten Vincent, since the Hierophant believed he had the book. Vincent, Bellamy echoed. She means me, Vince said. Adeline startled, and the others seemed surprised too, as though they'd forgotten he could speak. Isn't it more likely that the blight wished everyone to know who had murdered Adam, and that's why it covered the walls with its name? Salt said. The Hierophant has again, I remind you, shown no inclination toward bloodshed. The fuck he hasn't, Charlie said. Salt's hooded gaze was on her, unrelenting. Now, how close to where Red was living was Paul Echo murdered? A few blocks, but I don't see what this has to do with... And how close to where Red was living was Adam Lockin murdered? Charlie sighed, frustrated. He lived in the house where the murder happened, but he'd left. He wasn't there. He hadn't been there in days. And who had he lived with in that house prior to leaving? Me, Charlie admitted. And isn't it likely that you got the book from Red, since you've been living with him? Rather than that, you broke through my extensive security. I could show everyone how I did it, Charlie offered sweetly. Yes, said Salt. That brings us to one other thing. Do you think there's a reason he insinuated himself into your life? Something about you he might have wanted. Charlie folded her arms over her chest, looking Salt in the face. I don't know. My tits? Maybe my ass? It broke some of the tension in the room. Vicereine snorted, Bellamy smiled. But Salt was undeterred. You don't suppose it's because you're a well-known thief? The charlatan who stopped taking freelance gigs, coincidentally, of course, right around the time she met Red. Charlie took a stuttering breath. It had been one thing for them to know she was a thief, but it was a little different for them to know she was someone they all had some experience with. Although she'd done a job or two for Vicereign, the others had only experienced her as a cause of misfortune. You've lost them, Charlie Hall. They're never going to believe you now. You should have figured that a billionaire would make a pretty good con artist. Tell us, did it inform you that it was a living shadow? Salt asked. Or did it give you a false name and a false history, along with its false face? Charlie couldn't help thinking of the fairy tale of the scholar's shadow, playing at love. Of Vince's hungry mouth on hers. Of him cooking her eggs. I know who Vince is, said Charlie. And I know who you are. You poisoned me when I was 15. Your people chased me through the woods. Don't talk to me about false faces. Bellamy raised his eyebrows. Adeline looked over at Vince, as though for confirmation. But it wasn't like Charlie thought any of the cabal would care all that much about something that had happened over a decade ago, to someone who was in a gloom, even if they believed her. But she wanted Salt to know. So, you have a grudge against me, he said smoothly, which was ballsy, but clever. Put your worst foot forward. Admit to one bad thing so they think you're honest when you deny another. His attempt to cast the blame on Vince was unnervingly convincing. Salt had strung together enough parts for it to make sense, especially since the proof could cut both ways. And he was rich, which always helped, while Vince was a terrifying monster, even without the question of the murders. The knowledge that she might not be able to turn this thing around ramped her nerves up even higher. Well, Malik asked Vince, did you kill those people? We know you can talk. Vince looked at him expressionlessly. Charlie thought his assessment of the situation might be even more grim than hers. I was Remy's shadow. I would have never hurt him. And I didn't touch Night Singh. Do you have anything else to add, Stephen? Vicereign asked. You have been acting strangely lately. I haven't been sleeping well, Stephen said, looking at them. I have a lot of nightmares. Bellamy touched his shoulder, and he flinched. I understand my punishment, Stephen told them. All I want is to be done serving out my sentence. Did you murder a glomist? He shook his head. No. I hunt blights, which is why I've been seeking Red. Just Red. Halfway through that second sentence, Charlie thought she could tell that something else seemed to be speaking. It was a smooth transition, easy to miss if you hadn't been looking for it. What made you so interested in the Liber Noctum? Vicereign asked. The Hierophant shrugged. Lionel promised that I could read it, to help with my work. How long had this blight been bound to a series of fuck-ups and ne'er-do-wells, forced to hunt its own kind? Charlie would have felt sympathetic if she thought it was interested in something other than killing her. Salt cleared his throat. Red is a deceiver. a thing formed of envy and corruption and hatred that my grandson sought to slough off. It has poured honey in this poor girl's ears. Let us end this ridiculous conversation and go back to the party. I will keep the blight restrained, and you can determine what to do with him tomorrow or the next day." "Wait," Charlie said. "I can prove I got the book from his safe. I can show you where it is, and I can open it." "I'm not sure that's—" Malik began. "I offered before," Charlie interrupted, "and he barely even acknowledged it. Right now, I am the only one with any proof. I have the Liber Noctem." "Which could prove your point as well as mine," said Salt. "And you forget, I have read." "Let me show you," Charlie said. "Please." Vicereine glanced at Salt. "Is it possible?" "Absolutely not," he said with a small smile. "My security is impenetrable. She has that book because the blight stole it." Bellamy raised his eyebrows. "Then why not? A small demonstration and we can go back to the party." Charlie's hands were sweating as she nodded to all of them. She set down the Liber Noctem on a table near where the Hierophant stood and ignored the way he moved automatically toward it. "Very well," Salt said. "Go ahead, thief." She walked to where Dante's Inferno sat and pulled it. One of the bookshelves swung open. "Interesting," said Vicereine. "Yes," said Salt. "I rather like that little room." Charlie went to the painting and pushed it so that the safe was revealed. Then she went to work. She already knew the codes, but she needed to make something of a show of the first part. So she found the notches all over again for them. It was dramatic and bought a little time. She could see they were impressed when the handle went down halfway. "What are we going to find inside?" asked Malik. "Gold, gems, the usual," Charlie said. Salt just smiled. He'd taken a few steps back from the others, one hand going to the inside pocket of his coat. When it came to the digital part, Charlie keyed in the code carefully. She looked back at the Cabal, at Vince, took a deep breath, and turned the lever. The alarm went off, filling the room with a sound like a siren. Salt punched in another code, and the sound stopped. "You did that!" she accused him. He shook his head, eyes lit with the satisfaction of winning. "Don't be ridiculous. You failed, that's all." "Okay, so open the safe," Charlie said, her heart speeding, a blur of hummingbird wings in her chest. "Prove you didn't." "Very well. I will indulge you one last time," he said, enjoying the moment enough to draw it out. He punched in what she could see were the same set of numbers that she'd used. The lever turned, and the door to the safe swung open. His phone. He'd slipped it out while she was working and activated the alarm as she finished. While she'd been showing off, he'd been finding a way to stop her. "We're sorry for doubting you," Malik said to Salt. "But you understand we had to." "Wait," Vicereine said, reaching past him. "I know that book." And from the safe, she took out Night Singh's notebook, papers detailing Salt's crimes in his own hand, shoved hastily back into the leather cover, edges sticking out. Right where Charlie had left it when she'd taken the Liber Noctem. Salt began, but no words came. Charlie had known the way to trap Salt since the day she'd spent with him. She'd thought it then, idly, not realizing how much it would matter. Let him dominate. Let him win. He'd be so certain he belonged on top that he'd never guess he was being drawn into a trap. He'd honestly believe that she gave him all that time while she futzed around with the first lock for no goddamn reason. He'd honestly believe that she could crack a safe but not be able to guess he had a security app on his phone. Miss Hall must have put it there, whatever it is, Salt said finally, recovering enough to realize he had to pin the appearance of Knight's book on someone else immediately. Lionel Salt was a planner. Charlie was sure he'd planned for being confronted with any number of his crimes. He'd be able to explain lots of true things. But no one can plan for planted evidence. I thought that I couldn't get into your safe, Charlie reminded him. Isn't that what you were trying to prove? Which is it? Did you hide the Liber Noctum in there, and I stole it while putting something else in your safe? Or did I lie about the Liber Noctum? And you're lying now. Lionel Salt cut his gaze toward the Hierophant. Admitting to the first was less damning, but it meant admitting he'd been stringing along a very old and powerful blight. Vicereine was opening the papers stuffed into the top of Knight's book, smoothing them out. Charlie wasn't sure that Salt knew what they were, but she could tell by the way Vicereine's expression shifted that she realized who'd written them. Malik frowned. I think it's time the Cabal spoke with you and Stephen separately, Lionel. Salt reached into his pocket and took out his matte black gun, pointing it directly at Charlie. You have made a very bad mistake crossing me, charlatan. Charlie froze. Vicereine's shadow cat roared as 3 shadows spread from Malik, their mouths full of teeth. Bellamy drew a sword of shadow. Lionel, Malik said, there's no need for this. Behind Salt, Vince lifted his wrists and the cuffs came away, falling to the ground. He stepped forward with inhuman swiftness, pressing the point of a letter opener to Salt's throat. Adeline made a sharp sound that was almost a scream. The sounds of the party seemed very far away. You said I was a creature of hate, Vince spoke in Salt's ear. And I do hate you. For Remy, whose blood is my blood, whose flesh is my flesh, and whose hate is my hate. For Shar, who will survive tonight. Aim that gun somewhere else, or I will hurt you, and go on hurting you until there is nothing but pain. You can't, Salt began, voice trembling. I'm sorry, Shar. Vince wore a small, sad smile. It was always going to happen like this. I knew he'd let me get close to him, and it'd give me a chance. When they found Vince waiting in the library, alone, Charlie should have realized something was off. Should have seen what the disappearance of the man in the suit meant. Should have realized what Vince had been making in the hotel room. Faux onyx tiles. Ones that made him seem safely cuffed when he was entirely able to pull his hands free. He had known that, Charlie or not, Salt was going to show him off to the Cabal. And then he'd planned to slip his cuffs and kill Salt before anyone would be able to stop him. And after that, Vince pressed the knife point harder, and a bead of blood trickled down Salt's throat like the track of a single tear. He made a choking sound, and his arm sagged, although he didn't drop his Glock. Still, it wasn't pointed right at her face. Charlie let herself breathe. Drop the gun on the rug, Lionel. Vicereine said. The blight will remove the knife, won't you? Will I? Vince asked lightly. I didn't come here planning on leaving. Lionel Salt's face had paled, and his eyes darted around. How odd the moment must be for him. Malhar had called shadows ghosts of the living, but Vince was the shadow of a dead man. Vince, who was almost Salt's grandson, who was that grandson's avenging specter. You're going to leave, Charlie told Vince, with me. Plans change. The Cabal knows what he's done. Surely they're not going to ignore the murder of one of their own. Vince lifted the point of the knife infinitesimally away from Salt's artery. I have done nothing! Salt's words came to an abrupt stop as the Hierophant stepped between him and Charlie. His back was to Salt, and his eyes blazed. The blight, looking down at her through Stephen's eyes, was ancient and wrathful. He held the Liber Noctum in his arms. Tell me, he said. Tell me about this book. Tell me about his lies. Charlie cleared her throat. Vince could probably answer this better. You, the blight said. She nodded. Okay. When Remy died, he pushed all his energy, his last breath of life, into his shadow. That's how Red became able to pass for human. She looked directly at the Hierophant, not allowing herself to flinch. The ritual? The one that was supposed to have made Red like this? It doesn't exist. It's not in the Liber Noctum. It's not anywhere. That was a thing I couldn't figure at first. Why would Mr. Salt tell me to find a book when it was locked away in his safe? She sucked in a breath and let it out slowly, forcing herself to pause for dramatic effect. Because he'd promised you something he could never give. The Hierophant's fingers closed over the metal, pressing hard enough to bend the edge. He convinced you to compromise yourself for him, Charlie said. And you know that young man you've been possessing isn't doing well. There's not much more energy there to take. Killing Night Singh was for nothing. Killing Paul Echo was for nothing. Killing Adam Locken was for nothing. Salt laughed, although it sounded forced. Is that what this is about? Of course I know how Red became the way he is now. It's all in the Book of Blights. It was hard to argue convincingly with a frail old man with a knife to his throat. She decided to ignore him. Red was already pretty solid because Remy had put so much of his own energy into him, and then cut him loose for short periods of time, over years. He started to appear like Remy, and to hold that shape. Isn't that right, Adeline? She gasped in surprise, as though Charlie had asked her something awful. You murdered your own grandson? Vicereine asked. And Knight? You lied to me! The words boomed out of Stephen's mouth, but the voice was nothing like his. Deceiver! I will strip the flesh from your bones! I will... The sound of the gun going off cracked through the air. The Hierophant fell on the rug, blood seeping from the wound, fingers clutching at it, mouth opening. And behind the body, the shadow of the Hierophant rose larger and larger. Breath of life, it said. The shadow swept over the body it had worn. Stephen gave a wordless howl as he withered, his skin shrinking in on itself, his body curling and then going limp. The blood around the bullet hole was dry, crystallized. The shadow towered over them, crackling with fresh energy. "Oh, God," Vicereine said. "Oh, shit." Salt ducked away from Vince's hand, bringing his hand up to touch the shallow cut at his throat. The blight looked down at them, growing, so that the library lights dimmed as shadow covered them. "If no one will give me flesh, then I will take it." "We have to contain it," said Malik. "I have weapons," Salt said. "Devices. Down through that corridor." But there wasn't time. The Hierophant lunged. Vicereine's shadow cat leapt to meet him, claws raking, but the blight only struck it aside. Bellamy stepped forward, holding up his shadow sword. The Hierophant grabbed hold, and the blade turned to smoke. Charlie grabbed Vince's arm. He looked at her, the way he had that night out in the cold, when he hadn't seemed to believe she would still touch him. "Come on," she said. "We have to go now." He shook his head. "I serve no longer!" The Hierophant threatened in a voice that was the rush of wind in the sky, the echo of an empty room, not human in the least. "I was made from your kind, but I am greater than you now. I will take all that I want, and you will serve me." Bellamy rushed down the hall toward the great room, calling a warning as he drew a dagger of shadow from his coat. Malik's shadow triplets circled his body, preparing for an attack. "No more hiding." Vince took her hand. His body started to blur at the edges. It was his eyes that went first, from hollow to empty to smoke. Then the gold of his hair, like sparks flying off a bonfire. Darkness licked at his body, as though threatening to devour him. "Vince!" Charlie shouted. The Hierophant's voice moved through the room like the howls of wind through trees. "All of you who bound me, who tied me to your weak wills and mewing ambitions, know me. I am Cleophas, and I will paint the—" Vince lunged into him. They crashed together down the hall, shadows on the walls, but where they hit, drywall shattered, plaster rained down. A painting was knocked loose, falling and cracking its frame. The Hierophant's hands became long claws, each one coming to a thin point. Its mouth opened wide, full of sharp teeth. It ran for the great room, Vince's shadow chasing after it. Charlie moved to follow when she felt cold metal against the back of her head. A gun. "Turn around," said Salt. She did. In all the commotion, no one remembered the Glock. At point-blank range, there wasn't much she could do if he shot her, but he basked in the satisfaction of having her for a moment too long. Charlie knocked his arm sideways. The shot went off, hitting the bookshelves and taking off a chunk of wooden trim. He swung the gun at her head as though he was going to bludgeon her with it. She grabbed his wrist and bit down on it as hard as she could. Howling in pain, Salt dropped the gun. She kicked it with her foot, sending it skittering across the floor. "You're nothing," he told her. "A smudge, a blotch on the universe, and no blotch is going to be my downfall." He punched her in the head with his other hand. She staggered, dizzily back and he hit her again. He was an old man, but he was strong and used to hurting people. I should have killed you when I had the chance, he told her. Oh, absolutely, Charlie said, because you're not going to kill me now. He grabbed hold of a poker by the fireplace and swung it toward her. Charlie ducked and grabbed for another tool from the stand. This one was disappointingly tipped with a metal dustpan, but she brought it up anyway, knocking back another attack. The metal clanged together, and she felt it all the way up her arm. Charlie's sole experience in this kind of fighting was playing with Posey in the lot by their old apartment, swinging sticks at one another. Unfortunately, that was the level of sucking she was bringing to this fight now. She needed to hit him hard enough that he'd go down and not get up. She knew it, and yet part of her was horrified at the thought. She hated Salt. She would have been glad if he were dead. But actually making him dead was another thing. He swung the poker at her leg. She jumped out of the way. He was an old man. Surely he'd tire out fast, wouldn't he? But the wild-eyed glee in his face made her think otherwise. He wanted to see her sprawled on the rug, wanted to crack her skull open, would be delighted to see her bleed. He whipped his poker toward her head as something grabbed for her hands. She threw herself to one side so that the poker skimmed over the side of her hip without really connecting. She hit the rug. His goddamn shadow, that's what had grabbed for her. She wasn't fighting just him, but his shadow as well. On the ground, Charlie rolled over and scrabbled for the gun. She whipped it up toward him, finger on the trigger. He stopped, his shadow drifting toward her like a cobra, moving back and forth on the wall above her. Charlie got up, keeping the gun trained on him. Stay where you are. You're not going to shoot me, he scoffed. With her free hand, Charlie pulled the onyx knife out of her bra. She removed the duct tape sheath by biting down on it and yanking. Salt looked amused. What are you planning on doing with that? That shadow of yours. It's not exactly yours, is it? It belonged to a Glomus before you. A good one, I bet. You wouldn't want anything less than excellence. So what? He said. She squatted down, keeping the gun on him. So, I bet it hates you. And with one long slash of the dagger, his shadow slipped free. Salt backed up so quickly that he tripped. On the ground, the shadow had formed a puddle on the floor, like an oil slick, and from the center something was starting to rise. Guess you were right about me not shooting you, she said, and left the library. Charlie got to the great room in time to see Vince and the Hierophant clash. Figures splashed on the wall, huge as titans. Someone had thrown open the doors to the garden, and cold air blew through the room, sending the curtains dancing. I have lived 200 years! The Hierophant howled in his voice that wasn't a voice. And I will live thousands more! Screams were all around Charlie. People were rushing from the room, bumping into her or drawing weapons of onyx. One glow-mist flew up on wings of shadow, holding out a glistening black blade. The Hierophant tore the shadow from her back, sending her spiraling down onto a coffee table. A flurry of onyx arrows flew toward the blights. The shafts sunk into both figures. Vince contorted in pain and surprise before the shafts fell from both, scattering on the floor. One archer ran to retrieve them, while others cocked back more arrows. I didn't come here planning on leaving, Vince wasn't going to survive this fight. She'd seen the way those teeth and claws and arrows sank into his body, the way his movements slowed and took on a staggering, drunken quality. The Hierophant reached out his hands, and the nails of his fingers tore long lines into the wall along both sides of the room. "Stop fighting me, Red! Together, we can become more powerful than any Blights since the massacre. We will be like the Blights of old and devour the very edges of the world." Vicereine used long black daggers to guide glow mists out onto the lawn. Malik stood in the gallery on the second story, some glittering cloth in his hands. 2 other glow mists were with him. Adeline stepped into the mouth of the hall, near where Charlie stood. Her fingers were flecked with blood. Vince was fighting to a purpose, Charlie realized, steering the Hierophant backward. He might get in a hard, staggering blow, might slice Vince's chest with those nails, but Vince kept pushing, kept making the Hierophant give ground. Too late, she realized what he was about to do. With unsteady hands, Charlie stripped off her triple onyx ring, the one that looked like fancy brass knuckles. She put it back on, the onyx facing the inside of her palm. Then she ran for the fireplace. Because that's what Vince had been backing the Hierophant toward. Vince, who maintained his position even when it meant absorbing hits instead of dodging them. Charlie felt the brush of electric air as the shadows moved above her. Vince threw himself at the Hierophant. She saw the Blight's nails sink into Vince's side. And then Vince rolled them both toward the fire, where he was going to immolate the Hierophant even if it meant feeding himself to the flames. Charlie only had time to lurch toward them, reaching out and grabbing his indistinct shape. She held on, the onyx forcing Vince solid in her hands, making him collapse on top of her as the Hierophant gave a furious scream. The flames leapt up, so high that they set the bottom of Salt's painting on fire. Malik and his assistants dropped a netting of jet beads moments later, catching Vince and Charlie inside. 33. Thief of Night. No one would let Charlie talk to him. Vicereine brought her to the dining room, and 2 people from Carapace held her there. Someone gave her a drink from Salt's fancy liquor cabinet. It was probably the most expensive whiskey she'd ever drank, and she couldn't taste it. They would have taken her back to the library, except they'd found Salt's body there, letter opener buried in his chest. And so Charlie sat, angry, adrenaline still racing through her veins. She stared at the polished wood of the antique sideboard, at the ridiculously ornate silver apern resting on top, and the hideous oil painting of a bowl of severed heads. Her eye went to the heavy silk drapes with tasseled gimp trim, down to a hand-knotted silk rug that had to be at least 100 years old. Someone had tracked ash onto it. The world was going to be better without Lionel Salt in it. She looked down at her red suit, the leg of which had been smeared with soot. Possibly, she was the one who tracked ash onto the rug. "You were right," Vicereine told her, pouring a highball glass of scotch for herself. "About Salt. About all of it, I suppose. I am sure you wanted someone to say that, so let me start there." "Great," Charlie said, starting to stand. "So let me talk to Vince." A gloom stepped toward her, expression grim, and she sat back down with a sigh. An unhappy smile came to Vicereine's lips. "We must contemplate our options when it comes to your blight. We've never seen one that could pass for human. Vince almost destroyed himself saving you, she reminded Vicereine. We know, truly. But you must accept that we're going to have to speak with him and come to a decision about how to proceed. Vicereine gave a heavy sigh. He's too dangerous to ignore. And who knows how many more like him are out there? Go home, Charlie Hall. I'm not leaving unless you let me talk to him, Charlie insisted. Eventually, Bellamy and Malik came into the room, appearing exhausted. Bellamy had a slash in his coat that she thought must have come from shadow claws. I can show you where Salt's secret dungeon is, Charlie offered, then raised an eyebrow. I can actually open his safe. Although your offer is appreciated, we can handle it from here, said Malik. You have my word. We won't hurt Red. We owe you both a debt. Charlie raised her eyebrows, not feeling particularly trusting. Wow, your word. That and $1 won't even buy me a decent cup of coffee. Malik scowled at her. He's too fascinating for me to let anyone touch a hair on his head, Bellamy said, which she actually believed. You can come see him at my place in 3 days' time. How about that? She glanced between the others, expecting to see some conflict about where he was going to be held, but there was none. Either they'd decided this before, or no one else wanted him. Okay, Charlie finally said, having run out of other options. Fine. 3 days. On her way out of Salt's mansion, she pocketed an antique inkpot and shoved a pair of solid silver candlesticks up her sleeve. Posey was waiting for her in the station wagon, dozing in the driver's seat. When Charlie got in, she jumped up in alarm. Then, seeing it was only her sister, she yawned. Where's Vince? Posey asked, squinting at the black, star-spattered sky, as though she could tell time by it. How long were you in there? Charlie shook her head. Drive. I'll explain. We have one stop before we go home. Do you remember Tina? After their detour, Posey took them back to their rental house, even though it was still taped off as a crime scene. Charlie crawled through the window to her bedroom, showered in her own bathroom, and slept on her own mattress. Her sister slept beside her, Charlie's shadow curled around them both. When she woke, the scent of bleach in her nose, she realized the sheets still smelled like Vince. She held her hands up in the air, long fingers, black nail polish already chipped. Clever hands, capable of picking a lock and opening a safe. She thought of reaching out for her shadow, grabbing Vince. If she hadn't guessed what he was going to do, if she hadn't gotten there in time, the momentum would have taken him into the fire. There wouldn't even have been a body. The thought made her feel hollowed out as she went through the motions of taking a shower. Part of her felt trapped in that upside-down world where he was already gone. Her gaze fell on the wall tiles, staring at the nothing that was where her shadow ought to be. The absence hadn't just shut a door inside her mind. It shut a door on a potential future. She wasn't going to be a glomist. She hadn't been sure she wanted to be. But still. Would Vicereine and the rest of them have listened to her more if she'd had a quickened shadow? Would they have let her see Vince? She'd been so certain he'd want to come home with her, but after thinking about it, maybe she shouldn't have been. When he met her, he wasn't used to being alone in the world and had limited options. Maybe he hadn't seen a future for himself past the end of Salt. But now he was in that future and, for perhaps the first time, could shape it as he wished. If the cabal let him, of course. She wondered what he thought of the swing for the fences and damn the consequences Charlie Hall that he'd never met before. Maybe they both had been holding themselves back, when the other person had been capable of rising to the challenge. When the other person might have been thrilled by the challenge. After she was clean and dressed in her own clothes, she waited for Posey. "Mom sent me like 17 messages about bringing back the station wagon," her sister said, emerging from her bedroom in fresh clothes. Charlie glanced behind Posey, at her shadow. Her sister followed her gaze, her brow furrowed with worry. "Is it weird?" "I don't know. Is it weird for you?" Charlie asked. Posey moved her lips silently, and the shadow swept around her, curling over her shoulders, looking for all the world as though it preferred to be there. Charlie couldn't help a shiver that was part recognition. "It's the most perfect thing that's ever happened. You won't believe all the things I'll teach myself to do." Posey's eyes were bright in a way they hadn't been in a long time, and that Charlie didn't want anything to dim. She headed to the window and jammed it open. "Well, come on. If Mom and Bob are desperate to get the station wagon back, we better get out of here, since I want to stop for coffee first," she said. "Thank all the gods," Posey said fervently. They stopped at Small Oven Bakery, where Charlie got 3 espressos in tiny paper cups and lined them up in front of her like shots. Posey poked at a sticky bun while looking at her phone. Charlie took the first of the espressos and downed it. Posey said, and turned the phone toward her sister. Early this morning, the Gazette received pages from a journal alleged to be written by Lionel Salt, implicating him in several open investigations, including that of Rose Alaband. Alaband's body was found in a burnt-out car along with the body of Salt's grandson, Edmund Carver, over a year ago. Both may have been Salt's victims. Other cases are likely to be reopened based on information in the pages, including Randall Grigoris, Ankita Eswaran, and Hector Blanco. Not only does the journal include detailed accounts of their deaths, but drawings of medical experiments conducted on their shadows. Handwriting examiners were able to confirm with 98% confidence that the writing in the journal was consistent with samples of Salt's handwriting that the Gazette had obtained. We reached out to Salt's representatives for comment, but we haven't heard back at this time. "You did this to Lionel Salt?" Posey said, astonished. "How?" When Charlie had opened the safe, she'd only been expecting to find the Liber Noctum, but there had been something else in there too. A notebook, from which a few pages had been torn out. It couldn't be too often that the Hampshire Gazette got a scoop like that. Charlie took her second shot of espresso, and then the third. "I didn't do it to him. He did it to himself." That Sunday, Charlie showed up for her shift at Rapture. Her mind wasn't in it, though, and she kept having to ask people to repeat their drink orders. She dropped 2 wine glasses and set an entire highball of absinthe on fire, instead of just the sugar cube. That glass broke too, and in a much more dramatic way. Partway through her shift, Odette pulled her aside. She thought it was going to be to scold her or ask her about a missing red pantsuit, but instead, it was to introduce her to the new bartender, the one taking Jose's ex's shifts. Charlie was surprised to see Don. "Hey," he said. "Top Hat got a new manager, and I decided I could use a change of scenery." "Well, this place is that," Charlie told him, and proceeded to walk him through what things were put where, how to use the register, and how many dry ice pellets to float on a drink. "They swallow it, we get a lawsuit," she told him. "Maybe we shouldn't have it on the menu," Don suggested. "It's going to take you a minute to get the vibe of this place," Charlie predicted. Around closing time, Balthazar came to the bar. "Pour us a last drink, whatever you're having," he told her. "Oh, I'm drinking too?" She smiled. "If I were you, I would be." She couldn't argue with that. Took down the brand new Lafroig 15, opened it, and poured them both 2 fingers. "So, your guy," he said. Charlie nodded. "I guess you heard. Quite a thing." "Does this mean you're back in business?" he asked. She shrugged. "After the spectacle I made of myself, I should probably lay low for a while." "Oh, I don't know. The charlatan's reputation is at an all-time high," he said, taking a sip of his drink and then wincing. "Ugh! This tastes like someone poured gasoline over a tire, set it on fire, and then put the fire out with dirt." Odette made her way over and sat down next to Balthazar. "Having some cocktails, are we? Well, don't leave me out." "You can have mine," Balthazar said, passing his drink over. "Please." Odette accepted it without complaint. Charlie poured Balthazar amaretto instead, which he took gratefully. "You see the news?" he asked Odette. "About Lionel?" Odette made a disgusted sound. "The funny thing is that I always knew he was a sadist and a bit of a narcissist. But interesting, and I thought self-aware. You can know who someone is and still have no idea how far they will go. I thought I understood his limits, and now I have to ask myself if it was because I didn't want the discomfort of realizing he had none." Charlie took a sip of her drink and wondered about her own limits. "Now they're saying he might be responsible for the death of Fiona's sweet boy." "Edmund Carver," Balthazar said, enunciating each syllable, his gaze going to Charlie. "I thought his mother's name was Chiara," Charlie said. Odette nodded. "Yes, I'm referring to Salt's first wife. That's how he and I met, through Fiona. Poor old thing. First losing her daughter, then her grandson, and now this. All within the span of 2 years." "How is it that you know absolutely everyone?" Balthazar asked. "Ah, but do I know any of them well?" Odette looked into the mirror, as though studying her own face. Balthazar sat up straighter. "Well, let me distract us from this increasingly morbid conversation with a bit of news. Do either of you know Murray, of Murray's Fine Jewelry?" "Sure," Charlie said, thinking of the silver ink pot and candlesticks she needed to sell. "Why?" "He closed the pawn shop," Balthazar said, raising his eyebrows. "Struck it rich. Retiring to Boca, apparently." Odette gave a delicate little snort. "You make it sound as though he dug up a pot of gold in his backyard." "Practically," Balthazar agreed. "Rumor has it he won it all with one lucky bet at the racetrack." "Huh," Charlie said. "Imagine that." The 3-day wait to see Vince was awful. Charlie's mind kept darting back and forth between scenarios. What if the cabal lied and hurt him after all? What if they wanted to experiment on him? What if they decided his existence was too big of a risk? What if they wouldn't let her see him after all? Her mind would careen along one path and then another, making imaginary moves and countermoves, a chess game played against herself to no purpose except indulging her anxiety. A snake eating its own tail and then choking on it. At least by then, she and Posey were back in their house. Winnie from Vince's work had been the tech hired to get rid of the bloodstains. She'd messaged Charlie to say that she'd done an extra thorough job on account of her friendship with Vince. She'd also given Charlie a whole bunch of information she never wanted about the weirdest places she'd found bits of Adam. For her part, Posey had spent the last few days with Malhar. She claimed that she was just doing some tests, now that she'd agreed to join his study. But Charlie thought there were too many meals involved for that to be strictly true. But it did mean Charlie was left with a lot of nervous energy and no one to snap at as she got ready, pulling on black jeggings, boots, and a sweater without any holes in it. The pants were stretchy enough that if she needed to do some quick moves, they could accommodate. And the boots were heavy enough to hurt if someone needed to get kicked in the head. Charlie's Corolla was in the shop, but she'd managed to locate Vince's van 2 blocks from the East Star Motel. She found keys behind the sun visor on the driver's side. Shoving 2 parking tickets into the glove compartment, she'd taken it home. That's what she drove over to Bellamy's stronghold. True to his mysterious nature, he'd taken over a watchtower in Holyoke. It was accessible only by trail and appeared abandoned from the outside. The front door was rotted along the bottom, its hinges thick with rust. Charlie knocked. Hard. A few moments later, it creaked open, revealing a girl with a shaved head and thick black makeup around her eyes. One magnetic eyelash hung slightly askew. A new piercing on her cheek appeared red and infected. Her shadow swirled around her like a snake ready to strike. Probably some kind of apprentice. "I'm here to see Vince," Charlie said. "Who?" the girl asked. If Bellamy and the others thought they were going to blow Charlie off, she was going to make every single one of them sorry. "The Blight." "Oh," the girl said. "Right. Come in. They're expecting you." The inside had the appearance of a castle or a tomb. The girl led her through chambers of bare concrete walls, occasionally marked with graffiti, and up a flight of stairs, to a room hung with brocade curtains. Thin red taper candles burned in silver skull Halloween candelabras. The cold cement floor was piled with cushions. Lounging on a red velvet beanbag was Bellamy. Charlie looked around warily. "Where is he?" "We're holding him in a room at the top of the tower, like a princess waiting for rescue," Bellamy said. "Unharmed." "He's leaving today," Charlie told him. "With me." Bellamy took a sip from a delicate cup, thin enough to be translucent. Bone china. "Go and speak with your Blight. Up the stairs, up, up, up. We'll talk again after." Charlie didn't like the sound of that, but in her eagerness to see Vince, she let it go. She started back toward the stairs and was stopped by a woman's voice. "Miss Hall," Adeline Salt said. She sat on a slightly ripped couch in a room full of locked metal cases of books. She had on dark washed jeans and an emerald-colored blouse that tied in a bow underneath her throat. Balanced on her thighs was a computer, its case rose gold. She had that strangely burnished look that wealthy people have, hair extra smooth and skin extra glowing. She couldn't have looked more out of place. Charlie leaned against the opening, not quite entering the room. "You've come to see Red, is that right?" "Oh, good. I'm sure he will like that. He was asking for you." Adeline's smile was completely disingenuous. "Vince," Charlie said. It was interesting to see Adeline trying to decide whether to argue over his name. It obviously bothered her, not that Charlie called him something else, but Charlie acting as though the name he went by with her was his real one. Well, it was what he called himself. "I've spoken to the Cabal. He's going to come home with me. I'm going to be his guardian, and he'll be able to pick up where Edmund's life ended. Oddly, there seemed to be a flicker of fear in her eyes. How exactly is he going to do that? Charlie asked. I've already begun the process of voiding the death certificate. Adeline smiled again, stiffly. You understand that's for the best, don't you? Red will be very wealthy, and he'll only be bound to me for a few years. The idea that Adeline might be considered a guardian for Vince, when by all rights she should be the one punished, was enraging. The possessive tone in her voice made it worse, and a whole lot creepier. Maybe that's not what he wants. Adeline tossed back her hair. You think he'd rather be skulking around with a thief? I think he'd rather do almost anything than live in your father's house, Charlie said. You didn't hear? One perfectly manicured eyebrow arched. My father died that night after being left alone with you. Stabbed 33 times with a letter opener. Tragic, Charlie said archly. She had heard. What did you do to him in there? Adeline asked silkily. I took his gun away and cut off his shadow, Charlie told her. Whatever happened after that, I wasn't there for it. Convenient, Adeline sneered. I'd agree. Charlie looked at Adeline's laptop, at the green leather Chanel shopper she'd carried it in, at the diamond studs in her ears. You're his only heir, aren't you? Adeline's hand went to her hair, nervously catching a strand of it between her fingers. Don't try to implicate me in your crime, she said stiffly. Your guilt is your own to wrestle with. In the great room, Charlie said. I was pretty distracted when you came in. The funny thing is that I still noticed you had blood on your hands. Charlie started toward the hall, then looked back over her shoulder. By the way, you're welcome. Charlie tried to walk calmly up the concrete steps, but when she hit the second landing, she found herself walking faster and faster until she was practically running. At the very top, she found a door, banded in onyx and locked with a bar. Charlie lifted it, surprised by the weight. Vince stood in the small, windowless room with his back to her. He appeared much the same as he always had been. Same broad shoulders, same height, same everything. But when he turned, his eyes were empty sockets, filled only with smoke. It made her think of his body as a shell, with some swirling creature living inside. Charlie thought of the tarot cards she'd pulled from Posey's deck. The conversion of the spiritual into material. The magician. When his eyes closed, she noticed that for his hair had darkened to bronze, as though the gold had blown off when he changed. He was dressed in a black button-up, and his pants were some kind of performance material that looked expensive. Remy's clothes. Charlie felt turned inside out by the closeness of him, like the man in that story he told at Barb's party, like a sock. All her vulnerable parts seemed to be showing. The slightest touch might hurt. I didn't go quite back together the way I was, did I? Vince asked her. Charlie realized that she'd stopped, going no farther into the room than that first step. No wonder he didn't look happy. He had to think she was afraid. And she was afraid, but only a little. She made herself walk toward him. The fool, walking off a cliff. I like it. It's weird. That small, surprised lift of the corner of his lip, as though he'd forgotten he could smile, was familiar enough for her to actually relax. The longer she looked, the less she minded the strangeness of his eyes. Why did you do it? Lie to you? He asked. Hide what I was? No, Charlie sighed, sitting on the arm of one of the patterned brocade sofas. Why fight the Hierophant? You almost died for nothing. None of these fuckers care about you. His smile widened. That is not a question anyone asked me since I got here. And they've asked a lot. Well, I don't think they're focused on your well-being. You don't say. Vince waved her toward one of the chairs, and she took in the rest of the room for the first time. There were 2 chairs, a mattress on the floor, sheets, and a small rug. No books, no heavy things, no sharp things. A single bright bulb burned above them. Vince had a cuff around his leg, studded with actual onyx and attached to a metal plate in the floor. It was possible that the onyx was keeping him solid. Charlie wasn't sure. She really wished she'd read a lot more of the books that she'd stolen. She sat, a small puff of dust going up when she did. Look, I'm kind of tense, he said. So could you just break it to me? I know you've got some feelings about me being a shadow. I've been trying not to think about it too much, Charlie told him. He looked at her incredulously. How's that working? I figured I could think about it when we got out of here. And maybe, Charlie said hopefully, we could even have a big fight about it. With screaming and throwing things. And I could tell you how stupid you were for thinking I was having an affair with Adam. After you described his murder, I figured that out for myself. You seemed pretty upset about the couch. He laughed before he could stop himself, his hand going to cover his mouth. I'm so sorry. It's not funny. It's a little bit funny, she admitted. He looked down at her with eyes that bled smoke. So what else do we have to fight about? She averted her gaze. When did you figure it out? That I was the girl you let out of Salt's house? In the bar, he admitted. That first night. And what? You wanted to screw around with someone you'd saved? There. Now that was what an argument was supposed to sound like. Maybe. No. I don't know. He either didn't notice the opportunity to squabble or squandered it. I like you, Shar. I always liked you. I should have said something, but I'm not a good person. I'm not even sure I'm a person at all. Oh. Surprised, Charlie took his hand and folded her fingers through his. They were surprisingly solid. You're a person. You're my person. He bent down to bring their clasped hands to his lips. That's when Charlie started to panic. Because they just had an abbreviated version of the argument. Okay, it had been more of a conversation. She'd been anticipating having when they got home. And the only reason for Vince to have it while imprisoned in Bellamy's tower was that he wasn't going home with Charlie. He was planning on leaving with Adeline, like she'd said. He was going to take up the mantle of Edmund Vincent Carver, as though nothing had ever happened. Get his old life back. Be the first Blight to hold a charity ball. So what happens now? Charlie asked, because she had to hear him say it. With us. There was something in the set of his jaw that made her think of how she described him to Adeline, as a lake that was still on the surface, with a whole drowned town inside. I killed the Hierophant. The Cabal needs a new Hierophant. No. Fuck no. Charlie threw herself out of the chair. She paced the room trying to get her thoughts under control. You can't let them do that to you. Not after everything you've done for them. It's not any worse of a job than cleaning up dead bodies in hotel rooms. His voice sounded calm, but his fingers were curled inward, as though he was about to fist them. I thought Adeline was going to be some kind of guardian or something, she said, frowning. He nodded. That's one way of looking at it, but I'll still be hunting blights. She scowled. You can't agree to this. How long before you don't just hate what's happened to you, but hate the person to whom you're bound? His gaze dropped from Charlie's. I hate her already. Oh. Now she understood Adeline's mealy-mouthed innuendo. And she understood exactly how bound Vince was going to be. They'd be tethered together. She'd be wearing him. That's why you and I need to be apart for a while, he told her. I will never stop feeling the way I do about you, Shar. But I won't be the same. Someone will be trying to control me. She remembered him talking in his sleep. Adeline, don't. The thought made Charlie's skin crawl. I can get you out of the cuff. We can run for it. He shook his head. If we did, they wouldn't be hunting just me. I don't care, Charlie told him. He put his hand to her cheek. They told me that I need to prove I'm trustworthy, and that once I do, I won't need to be tethered. I'll get out of this. I'll find a way for us to be together. Oh, they were going to find a way out of this, all right. And they're going to do it today? Of course they were. That was why Adeline had been there. They were going to stitch him on as soon as Charlie departed. Vince turned away so that she couldn't see much of his face, but he looked resigned, and she was making it harder. Today, yes. I've already agreed. She could tell that he hated that she was making it harder. Tell me one thing, she said. If you could, would you choose me over anything? He said. Okay, she said, finally. I think this is a bad decision, but I've made lots of those. This was what he'd learned from being Remy's shadow. If there was a problem, he was supposed to throw himself at it. He was supposed to let himself get captured so he could try to kill an ancient blight. Was supposed to give up his freedom to make sure the Cabal wouldn't feel threatened. If there was a terrible task, he was the one who was supposed to do it. If there was a difficult emotion, he was the one who was supposed to feel it. His golden lashes caught the light as they swept down over his cheek, hiding the smoke of his eyes. Sometimes there are no good decisions. And wasn't that just the truth? If I can't talk you out of it, then how about I distract you? I bet we've got a couple of minutes before they kick me out. His eyebrows went up, clearly astonished. Maybe he thought she'd have a problem with his smoke-filled eyes, or the fact that he was a blight. Or maybe he thought that no one was crazy enough to want to screw around in a cold concrete room with someone whose ankle was cuffed to the floor. Well, welcome to the absolute mess that was Charlie Hall. She reached up and dragged his mouth to hers. For a moment, he went utterly still, and she wondered if he was going to push her away. Shame heated her cheeks. Then he kissed her as though he had never thought to do so again, hands cradling the back of her head, fingers in her hair. For a moment, there was only the sensation of lips and teeth and tongue, of skin, and the scent of him that wasn't masked by bleach or soap, like a charge of electricity in the air. And when he pressed her back against the wall like he had outside the bar that first night, She grinned up at him. "Charlie Hall," he whispered into her hair. "There will never be anyone like you, for which we can all be grateful," she whispered back, regretting wearing the stretchy pants, which were hell to get off. The hard part was walking out of the room, but she did, stomping down the hall, waiting for him to call her back to tell her that he'd made a huge mistake and they should run after all. He didn't, despite how much she wished he would. Once she'd gone down 4 flights of stairs, she found her way back to Bellamy and his red velvet beanbag. He wasn't alone. Vicereine was there, and Malik. Neither of them seemed particularly surprised to see her, but they also didn't seem happy about it. "Hello," Charlie said, brushing past Malik to find a cushion of her own to settle on. "You did us a service," he said. "The Cabal owes you something. We'd like to settle our debts. If the larger world gets involved, our disputes will only make them nervous." "We reward our friends," Vicereine said, "and punish our enemies. You've proved to be our friend, Charlie Hall." Pirate justice. Carrot and stick. "We want to help you," Malik said. "Ask us for something." "You know what I want," Charlie said. "Let him go. Or at least let him be unbound. Haven't you learned from the last Hierophant?" "What we learned was not to trust blights," Malik said. "Imagine how much worse it would have been if the Hierophant had been unbound." "Not worse for Stephen," Charlie said. "Stephen stole shadows," said Bellamy. "Quickened shadows, shadows of vulnerable people. Sold them to dealers. Don't have too much sympathy for him." Malik nodded. "And the problem wasn't Stephen. We believe that Lionel dosed him with something that allowed the Hierophant to take possession of his body. Over time, it either learned how to do that on its own, or they continued to drug him. Ask us for something that doesn't have to do with the blight. You'd be surprised what we can make happen." Charlie supposed the Cabal could give her a lot of stuff. Her sister re-registered for school in the spring. A scholarship. Pay off Charlie's medical debt while they were at it. Get her a spanking new car. Hell, they might give her Salt's Phantom if she asked. But Posey had never wanted to go to college, and Charlie didn't want to be bribed. "I want you to let Vince go." Malik made a frustrated sound. She couldn't help it. It was her nature. Charlie Hall, refusing to learn from her mistakes, eager to throw herself against the same wall again and again, no matter how much it hurt. What did Adeline Salt give you to let her become his guardian? Bellamy looked surprised. "I think you misunderstand the situation." "You're letting her take him home, aren't you?" Charlie said. Vicereine gave a cruel little smile. "In a matter of speaking. But this isn't something she chose. Do you know what she will be expected to do?" "Hunt blights," Charlie said. "And do you know why it's considered a punishment? A way to make up for past crimes?" "Because it's dangerous," she guessed. "Very," said Malik, in slightly horrified tones. What was it that Balthazar had told Charlie? That she could steal the breath from a body, the hate from a heart, the moon from the sky. Well, in this case, maybe she didn't need to steal anything. Maybe they'd give her everything she wanted. All it would cost was her secrets. Charlie pasted a smile on her face, glanced at the old Fear Less tattoo looping across the skin of her inner arm. "Fine," she said, through gritted teeth. In that case, I'd like to confess. Confess? Vicereine echoed, puzzled. Do you remember when Bran Araya had his secrets written with a laser on grains of rice and kept them in a glass jar under his pillow? I snatched that like I was a tooth fairy. Or remember when Eshy Godwin got that book with all the detailed illustrations and no one could make head or tail of it? The secrets were written in the artwork, so I cut those pages straight out. I'm not sure she's opened it up to know they're missing. I took Owain Cadwallader's 18th century memoir and discovered a whole pile of notes stitched into the interior binding of another book. I forget the title, but it had these cool metal catches on the side, and took those without anyone being the wiser. Oh, and I grabbed Jaden Coffey's whole collection of 70s shadow magic zines. Want me to go on? I've been doing this for years. She felt giddy, like she was sliding down a hill, no way to stop now. All the exultation of finally admitting to something. You cut out pages from Eshy's book? Vicereine sounded pissed. I'm a bad person. Charlie reached into the pocket of her jeans, took something out, and threw it to Malik. Startled, he caught it. When he looked at what was in his hands, his brows drew together. I also grabbed your wallet when I brushed by you. Sorry. You are making some very dangerous enemies, Vicereine told her. What's all this about? Malik was tight-jawed. What are you doing? Punish me, Charlie said. I'm loads worse than Adeline. You want it tied to you? Bellamy asked. The idea of someone inside her head, someone she couldn't hide her worst thoughts from, someone she loved, made her feel a little queasy. Yes. Reward or punishment, give him to me. I'll be the Hierophant. When Vince came into the room, necklaces of onyx draped over his throat and one attached to his arm like a leash, his eyes changed at the sight of her. He turned to Bellamy. But where's Adeline? We sent her home, Malik said. Then who? Me, Charlie said. If you can make a stupid decision, then I can make one too. He shook his head. This is supposed to be a punishment. Oh, I know, she said. You're going to be stuck in my head, with all my secrets. Even I don't know all my secrets. It's going to be awful. He appeared to be seriously considering strangling her. Shar. She's volunteered, Vicereine said, and confessed to quite a few crimes just to convince us. The look he gave her was scathing. Did she? I'll need your feet to be bare, Vicereine said, all business now. Charlie reached down to take off her boots. They were already untied, the laces loose from kicking them off in the tower. Vince appeared to be belatedly wondering if he could break free of the onyx chains and escape. She saw him pull against the shining loop over his wrist. It must have held, because his expression set into grim lines. You don't know what I'll be like after. No one does, he said under his breath. You'll still be you, Charlie whispered back. Bellamy said something to Malik, and both of them looked amused. Charlie didn't think it was directed at her, but it ramped up her nerves. She reminded herself that she'd been through this before, cutting loose her own shadow as she sewed it to her sister's feet. Posey had to finish the sewing, and neither of them was a great seamstress. Still, it seemed to be attached, and Posey seemed fine. She reminded herself that she was stealing Vince right out from under their noses. Vicereine directed Charlie to stand in front of him, which she did. When he wanted me to tell you hello, she whispered. Your boss is furious, but probably you don't want your old job back anyway. Oh, and believe it or not, Posey might actually apologize. Vince looked down at her and sighed, but when she reached for his hand, he let her take it. She squeezed once before he returned to shadow. The front door of the watchtower closed heavily behind Charlie as she crossed the lawn, frost-rimed leaves crunching beneath her boots. Vince, she said, under her breath. See, I told you we were going to leave together, and now we're out of there. He didn't reply, but when she glanced down, the shape of the shadow that followed her was his. She stuck her hands in the pockets of her coat, listened to the wind whistle through the trees. I know you're mad, she said. In the van, she pulled out the tactical knife attached to her keys. Pressed the point against the pad of her ring finger until a drop of blood welled up. Vicereine said I was supposed to do this right away. So, here we go. That seemed to get his attention. The shadow swirled around her in a dark cloud. She felt something against her skin that might have been a tongue, except that it wasn't wet. The sensation made her shiver. Vince, she said again, starting to get nervous. Stop messing with me. Say something. A whisper came in her mind, making her sit up straight. You're not Remy. I'm your girlfriend, she said, voice unsteady. And this joke isn't even a little bit funny. Charlie stared at the shadow that spilled across the passenger seat, at the hectic light filtering through the trees. Watched as his shadow took shape without her control. A figure of darkness with same burning eyes and no recognition in them. Triumph turned sour in her mouth. His voice was soft with menace. If that were true, I would know you. And I don't. She thought of the story that Vince had told her, about running away from Salt's, about waking up beneath that underpass without memory of how he got there. She'd taken that to mean he hadn't remembered the time between Remy's death and waking up. But maybe he'd lost more than that, and for longer. Or maybe this was different. Maybe he'd never recall sitting with her under the stars. Never remember bringing ice to Barb's party. Never remember eating buttered toast and drinking coffee in bed. She felt the burn of tears, blinked them back, tasted salt in the back of her throat. Outside, night was coming on. A few single flakes of snow fell. She slammed her fist against the steering wheel. He watched her, smoke curling from the sockets of his eyes. There'd always been something wrong with Charlie Hall. Crooked from the day she was born. Never met a bad decision she wasn't willing to double down on. I'm a good enough thief to steal a shadow from a tower, she told him. I can steal back your heart. He said nothing in return. And a few moments later, the shadow had melted away, leaving her alone.